Do you ever wonder why the miracles of Jesus stop with Jesus? Why we don't get miracles like the ones that we heard today anymore? Do you ever wonder about all the hungry people in the world? How many more than 5,000 hungry people are there out there? If we are the body of Christ in the world now, this body that Christ says can do even greater things than he, how come we don't see that happening in our world? How come suffering seems to increase year by year? From wars to famine to poverty to drought, natural disasters. What do we do with a reading like today's gospel, which so easily and eloquently describes feeding 5,000 hungry people, when in our world so many are suffering and we are powerless to do anything about it? The question we need to ask ourselves is not so much why these miracles don't happen today, but to begin with the gospel and ask, what is the true miracle of this gospel? We have been trained to think so well and critically, to poke holes in stories, to discern fact from fiction. The more educated we become, and we are an educated bunch here, the harder it is to have faith. We know that it's not humanly possible to feed 5,000 people from a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. We know it's not humanly possible to walk on water. And so we try to figure it out. We try to wrap our minds around these miracles. And there are lots of explanations out there. You can do a Google search and find out for yourselves. I've mentioned to you before an article that I read about Jesus walking on water and how these scientists got together and figured out that by a unique confluence of water temperatures and weather, there was a floating ice sheet just below the surface of the Sea of Galilee that was created, and so Jesus could walk out there. But it wasn't big enough for Peter, so when Peter stepped out, he sank. Others have postulated that the feeding of the 5,000 was possible because people really did have food, and once one person shared, then everybody shared. We try to find the humanly possible ways these stories are fact, and in the process, we turn Jesus into some sort of magician, skilled with sleight of hand and trick of eye techniques. All this mental energy we spend on such things robs the gospel of its meaning. When Jesus is a magician, life is only tricks. I don't know about you, but that's not the kind of God I want to invest my life in and find my life given back to me in return. This kind of thinking about Jesus, about the Bible, about the relationship between God and humanity is so pervasive that we have had generations leave the church because of it. I was one of them. I stopped going to church when I was 13 and figured out, that Noah's Ark story, I don't know if that's really true. Or where did Adam and Eve get all these kids? How were generations built from one couple? So many have found this way of looking at scriptures to be empty, a place of magical Jesus' lifetime tricks and embedded with impossible moralistic ideals that no human person can live up to. So let's shift the focus away from the way our minds want to grapple with such miracle stories, the way our minds want to understand the magic trick that makes the feeding of the 5,000 possible and the walking on water doable, and shift our thinking toward another way of looking at today's gospel. Jesus lived in a time of limited goods. This is something that we don't have much of a sense of. But it was a very real experience. If one person had 2 loaves of bread, that means that someone else had none. Everything was limited, and there were those who had what they needed, and there were those who didn't. We meet the compassionate Jesus today, teaching the crowds and recognizing their need. In this story, Jesus takes what is a limited good, these 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish, and makes it into such plentiful resources that everyone could eat and be filled with leftovers. Now, is that about the food? Maybe, but this is the Gospel of John. And what we know about the Gospel of John is that his stories about the life of Jesus function on 2 levels. The level of the outward and visible, in this case, food for hungry people, everyday stuff. And then there is the level of inward and spiritual. The things of the story pointing towards something that happens inside us individually and communally by grace. Food is sustenance for the body. And in the case of the feeding of the 5,000, food is a symbol of the sustenance for the soul through the grace of God. Now, Jesus demonstrates in this miracle story that grace is not a limited good. He takes the limited good of food and feeds 5,000 people with it. Grace works the same way, except it's not a limited good. It is not a resource that one person may have more of and another person have less of. It may feel that way at times, especially when we're going through times of struggle and suffering in our lives, when things are challenging and maybe way beyond our control. But the truth of God's gracious love is that there is enough for everyone, with plenty left over. I want us to remember the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, not only as food for hungry people, but as gracious love for hungry souls. 5,000 people came to be filled, and they were satisfied with the teaching of Jesus. Isn't that what we all want? Don't we all have hungry souls that are waiting to be fed? To have the anxiety that drives our lives released in exchange for the gracious and compassionate love of God? I have this theory that all the problems, all the suffering, all that we struggle with as human beings in the world will lose its power when we truly know ourselves to be filled with God's gracious love. All the war, all the hatred, all the illusions of separateness and difference that we use to define ourselves against another person or a group against a group will dissolve when we truly know ourselves as alive in God's gracious love. All that raises our anxiety and dashes our hopes will lose its powerful grip when we know ourselves to be filled with God's gracious love. There is enough of this holy love for everyone, with plenty to spare. We only need to show up and trust that when we open our hearts, God will fill them with love.